Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be dissecting a super interesting conversation between Joe Rogan and comedian Michael Kosta.
From the Joe Rogan Experience, right?
Yep, straight from the Joe Rogan Experience. And we've got the transcript right here. What we're going to do is really try to pull out the most interesting, the most insightful points from their conversation.
There's a lot to cover. From crafting comedy to these really surprising shifts in sports and how we all sort of navigate this, this world that keeps getting more and more complex.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot.
So consider this like a concentrated dose of really cool ideas. We're sifting through their entire conversation to bring you, the listener, just the really good stuff, the key points.
That's right.
And hopefully spark some new ways of thinking for you, the listener.
Absolutely. So what's in this deep dive for you?
Well, their conversation really kind of centered around some core themes. We're looking at how creativity works, especially in the world of comedy, how people find their passions in their careers and actually pursue them, sometimes even making huge leaps.
Right.
The fascinating ways both comedy and sports are evolving, right in front of us.
Yeah.
And even some really thought-provoking and often pretty funny observations about where society and technology are taking us.
It's a lot. It's a real mixed bag of topics.
Yeah, it really is.
And perfect for someone who, likes getting a good understanding of things, but not spending hours and hours and hours,
Not getting lost in the weeds.
Yeah.
All right, let's unpack this. So they spent a decent amount of time early on talking about Jon Stewart and his return to The Daily Show.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they both kind of honed in on Stewart's ability to connect with people, through this really unique blend of sharp reasoning and humor. He's able to make fun of just about anything, even the less highbrow stuff, the dick jokes.
Yeah.
And still somehow find that common ground with his audience.
It's really remarkable.
It really is. And they also talked about the dynamic of the writer's room, right?
Yeah.
They described it almost like a seminar with a college professor, where everybody's debating different perspectives and tossing around ideas. But then, a well-placed silly joke could still make it into the final cut.
Yeah.
So it's really that balance between insightful commentary and just, making people laugh.
It is. And Costa, he made this really interesting point about how important it is for comedians especially to stay connected to their core comedic instincts.
Yeah.
That fundamental sense of what they find funny and what makes their audience laugh. It's like no matter how much a comedian's style might change over time,
right,
they need to hold on to that initial spark, like what got them into comedy in the first place. Well, yeah, and if you think about it, that applies to any field. It's important to maintain that connection, right?
Yeah.
To your foundational understanding, even when things around you are constantly changing.
Yeah.
That core knowledge is what lets you adapt and innovate effectively in any new situation.
Okay. That's a good point. And then they talked about something that really stuck with me. This idea that your ideas, your creations, they're not actually you,
Right.
There's this need for a healthy detachment from what you create.
Oh, I see what you mean.
And Costa actually told this kind of funny anecdote about leaving his joke book on a train.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he accidentally left it, but then he ended up connecting with the person who found it.
Oh, wow.
And it's like those very personal thoughts, those unfiltered, sometimes silly ideas scribbled in that book.
Right.
They're still just things. They're not like some fundamental part of his identity.
That brings up a really interesting point about how we relate to the things we create, doesn't it?
It does.
I mean, whether it's jokes, or business strategies or artistic projects, being able to step back and look at them objectively is so important for growth. And it helps you not take criticism so personally.
Right.
Which is so crucial in any creative field.
And then they brought up this analogy about gold mining for writing jokes. They were pretty frank about it, They said that a lot of the process is just stuff you have to get through.
Right.
But every now and then you unearth a real gem.
Yeah.
The key thing, though, is to just keep digging, that ongoing effort, even when you feel like you're sifting through dirt. It made me think about how scientists talk about research. So many experiments fail, but you keep going for that one breakthrough.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to think about any kind of creative work.
Yeah.
The idea that consistent effort, just doing a lot of it, often leads to those moments of brilliance. It's about developing the discipline to show up and do the work, trusting that the gems will eventually be there.
They also brought up Stephen Pressfield's War of Art. and that whole universal struggle against resistance, which is just procrastination.
Yeah, we all know that one.
We all know it. And I really liked this concept that they talked about, which is treating creativity like a profession.
Oh, interesting.
So like setting a specific time to work, getting rid of distractions, and just making yourself available for those moments of inspiration, whether you call it the muse or just your subconscious, you know?
Right.
It's about putting in the hours, just like any other job.
Well, that makes sense. It aligns with a lot of research on productivity and creative output. Like by having those routines, by setting aside dedicated spaces, you're basically telling your brain that this is important, you know?
Yeah.
And that can really help you overcome that initial inertia, that block.
That's a great point. And Kosta also talked about, his early days doing comedy and how new material would come to him so quickly back then.
Yeah. There's that energy when you're just starting out, right? You're constantly experimenting, discovering new things.
Absolutely. Okay. So we talked about the creative side of comedy, how it all works. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about career changes. This idea of finding your calling.
Right.
This part of their conversation had some really inspiring moments. They told this story about this finance guy from Egypt in his 30s, I think.
Okay.
He found this intense passion for brisket, and he actually moved all the way to Austin, Texas to open a barbecue restaurant.
Wow.
That's a pretty big life change.
It is. It really is. And what's so compelling about that is that, he was willing to make such a significant change later in life.
Yeah.
And he dedicated himself to really immersing himself in this craft by going straight to the source, Texas, for barbecue. It's like that idea of going to Brazil to learn jiu-jitsu.
Right.
You go to the heart of it to really learn it right.
And it ties in really well with Kosta's own story, leaving a stable job coaching tennis to chase comedy, even though it meant less money at first.
Yeah, big drop in income.
Yeah. He was willing to be poor to do what he loved.
It makes you think about what's really important, doesn't it? What are you actually valuing?
It does. And they acknowledge, how challenging it can be to make those kinds of career changes later in life. Like when you're young, you have a certain freedom. But as you get older, you have more responsibilities.
Absolutely.
Mortgages, family. It's a different calculation.
Yeah, the stakes are higher for sure.
But they also brought up some really encouraging examples, like comedians who found success later in life. Rodney Dangerfield, right? He came back after years of selling aluminum siding.
That's right.
And then there's Schimmel, didn't even start comedy until he was 36.
Wow.
Kosta even felt like he started late at 25 or 27, which is crazy.
Yeah, that seems so young to think of as a late start, especially in a creative field.
It really does. It really challenges this idea that you have to find your passion and be successful when you're young.
Yeah, like your life is over if you haven't made it by 30 or whatever.
Yeah. Exactly. And then they got into talking about the importance of a really strong local comedy scene. And they used Boston as this amazing example, like a place with all these world-class comedians that no one really knew outside of Boston.
It's like this hidden talent pool.
Yeah. Acosta called it a cheat code for development,
right?
Like constantly training with the best athletes. Have you seen that in other creative fields where a specific city or scene just kind of incubates this amazing talent?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you have so many talented and driven people all in one place, it creates this environment for growth.
Yeah.
Constant exposure to high-level work, the collaboration, the competition that pushes everyone to get better faster.
And they said the motivations of those Boston comedians were pretty unique. It was more about local success, Maybe a little partying, a little golf. They weren't really chasing national fame.
Yeah, like a tight-knit group.
Yeah, they were like these kind of rough and tumble characters that would just dominate on stage. They would even make it tough for visiting comedians, like Billy Crystal, apparently.
No way.
That sounds like a really intense scene.
It does. It paints a picture of a very, I guess, localized and maybe even a little insular artistic culture. Like they were focused on immediate impact within their community, and they were very protective of their scene.
Yeah, and they talked about how that scene has changed. Like there's less of that heavy drinking culture now. The internet has obviously had a huge impact. Now you can share these little clips online instead of building a whole hour-long act.
Right.
And there's definitely a shift towards more respectful behavior, like backstage. I mean, that story about Vancouver was
wild,
yeah. It makes you wonder if the whole way comedy develops is changing.
It's a different landscape now. Those rapid feedback loops on social media and the increased awareness around how people treat each other in the workplace. It's all reshaping comedy for sure. And they mentioned that, guys like Louis C.K. and Attell, they still kind of operate outside of that immediate online clip culture.
Right.
So there are different paths.
All right. Let's move on. They talked about the evolution of sports and of how our appreciation for them can change over time. And they talked about just the simple beauty of watching someone get noticeably better at something.
Yeah.
They talked about like the tennis player, Andreeva. She's really been improving quickly.
Right.
And then they were talking about old footage of Djokovic, like just seeing that arc of development, potential becoming reality.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
It's like that speaks to something very human.
Yeah.
That fascination with progress and mastery. Seeing someone really dedicate themselves to a skill and pushing those boundaries, it's inherently rewarding to watch.
And Kosta made a really good point about how your appreciation for a sport gets so much deeper when you understand the techniques.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
He used martial arts and tennis as examples. Like, there's this whole language of the sport that only people who've really practiced it understand.
I get that.
He even talked about, like, trying to explain the nuances of tennis to his wife and just struggling with it.
I can relate to that. Trying to explain the offside rule in soccer.
It's tough.
It's impossible.
Yeah. It's like you're trying to describe colors to someone who's never seen them before.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the more you understand the intricacies of something, the more you can appreciate it. It's like gaining access to this secret code,
That unlocks a whole new level of understanding.
Exactly.
His own relationship with tennis has changed, too. Like, he used to kind of shy away from it because of the whole elite stigma around it.
Yeah.
But now he embraces it fully. And then he told this crazy story about, like, Freeway Ricky Ross, this incredibly talented but illiterate tennis player who became a major figure in the drug trade and was unknowingly working for the CIA at one point.
Whoa, I've never heard of him.
It's wild, and it really challenges that stereotype of who plays tennis.
Yeah.
Like where it can lead you in life.
Yeah. And they also pointed out that tennis is actually pretty accessible, You don't need a ton of fancy equipment. And you see top players coming from all sorts of backgrounds. South America, Russia, not just like traditionally wealthy countries. It's like this really democratic sport.
It is. Kosta also talked about this concept he has of being a lucky loser in tennis.
Okay.
And how playing the sport actually gave him skills that he could use in comedy, like discipline, work ethic, dealing with success and failure on your own.
That makes sense.
He even talked about crying after losing a junior tennis final when he was 8 years old.
Oh, wow.
Like, that early exposure to competition and those emotions really shaped him.
It's interesting how those seemingly unrelated fields can connect. The mental toughness you develop in one area can be so valuable in others. And those early experiences with winning and losing, especially in individual sports, they build this resilience that helps you in anything you do.
They also got into that age-old debate, natural talent versus hard work. And Kosta talked about being really into DJing, but never actually getting good at it. But tennis, it just came naturally to him.
It's like some things click and others don't, no matter how much effort you put in.
Right. And they talked about how, certain physical traits can give you a huge advantage in some sports, like height and wingspan and tennis and boxing.
You brought up Pete Sampras.
And Deontay Wilder.
Yeah, good examples.
Yeah.
It seems like the people who really succeed usually have a combination of both, like a natural inclination and then that hard work and dedication.
Speaking of Wilder, they talked about his crazy knockout power. It's unbelievable, especially considering he's often smaller than his opponents.
Right.
They analyzed his fighting style as being almost entirely built around landing that one devastating punch.
The blam, as they called it.
Yeah. And they talked about how rare it is for fighters to take those kinds of shots, Tyson Fury being a notable exception.
Wilder's career really shows you how effective a single exceptional skill can be. He focused on that knockout power, even if his overall boxing technique wasn't as polished. And it made him this incredibly dangerous fighter.
Yeah. And Fury, being able to survive those punches.
That says something about his toughness.
That's incredible. And this led them to a discussion about, the impact of hard hits and combat sports in general.
Yeah.
Kosta shared his experience of being TKO'd in a kickboxing match. And he talked about this weird sensation of his legs just not working.
Scary.
It sounds almost surreal.
Yeah, it really highlights how disorienting it can be.
Yeah.
Like when your body experiences that kind of impact, your nervous system reacts in strange ways.
They compared how knockdowns are handled in boxing versus UFC, that standing 8 count versus the immediate ground and pound.
Right.
And they debated which one might actually be safer long term. But they ultimately acknowledged that all combat sports are inherently dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And they talked about some really intense knockouts, like Alex Pereira's flying knee finishes in kickboxing and UFC, and how risky it is to let a fighter keep going after they've clearly been hurt.
Yeah. Like, that raises questions about the responsibility of the referees and officials.
It does.
They have to make those tough decisions in the moment.
They do.
Balance the fighter's spirit with their safety.
And then they got into the flying knee specifically, how effective it can be, but also how dangerous. Like John Jones opening a title fight with a flying knee when he was only 22.
Wow.
But then there's Fedor knocking out Arlovsky when Arlovsky tried a flying knee.
It's a high-risk, high-reward move.
It really is.
So you need perfect timing. Otherwise, you're wide open.
Yeah. And then they talked about something that's like almost an unspoken agreement in those sports, that simple tap, surrendering in the middle of all that violence.
Interesting.
They talked about the consequences of not respecting the tap, like what happened with Amar Paul Harris, and also the humbling experience of having to tap out yourself.
It's like this mix of extreme competition and a baseline level of respect.
Yeah.
It's recognizing when you're beat to avoid getting seriously hurt.
And this led them to a conversation about commentary.
Well,
like the passion involved in calling fights. Kosta talked about how immersive it is,
Yeah.
being totally in the moment with like Daniel Cormier and John Anik, and how important it is to represent the fighters and all the work they put in.
Good commentators don't just describe what's happening.
Right.
They provide context, they explain the strategies, they convey the emotions.
Yeah. It's almost like they become storytellers,
Right.
enhancing the whole experience. And it's so cool how Kosta, with his background in tennis, has really embraced the world of MMA commentary.
Yeah. It makes sense, though.
It does.
It's got the martial arts experience.
Yeah. He's even done commentary for professional pool because he understands the game so well.
That's awesome. It shows you the value of having a diverse set of knowledge.
It really does. Of course, they had to talk about their favorite pool movies. The Hustler was the clear winner over The Color of Money. And they mentioned that Jackie Gleason was actually a pretty good pool player in real life.
Really? I didn't know that.
Which must have made his performance even better.
Oh, for sure. The Hustler is such a classic. It really captures the psychology of the game, the intensity.
Absolutely. And then they briefly touched on the rising popularity of padel.
Or paddle.
Yeah, paddle tennis. They compared it to tennis and pickleball and even mentioned Kid Rock's love for pickleball.
Seems like racket sports are having a moment.
They are. All right. Let's get into some of their societal observations and their thoughts on technology. Things got really interesting here. They talked about how ridiculous it is, like that strong anti-American or anti-Canadian sentiment. And they briefly mentioned Canadian politics, but in a very neutral way.
Yeah.
Just this general hope that the U.S. and Canada could get along better. It's strange when neighboring countries have those tensions.
You'd think they'd be best buds.
You would think.
Sharing a continent and all.
Exactly. And then they went deep on the whole issue of power metals, for batteries and electric vehicles. And they brought up the ethical problems with cobalt mining in Africa, the child labor, the toxic conditions.
Tough stuff.
It is. And how all of this connects back to the devices we use every day, like our phones. And they talked about the challenges of finding ethical and sustainable ways to source and manufacture these materials here in the U.S.
It's like this hidden cost of our technology.
It is. They then talked about, the wild things technology can do now, like phones that automatically call for help after a car crash, and the crazy influence of algorithms that track everything we do online.
Right, and shape our experience.
It's like we're living in a sci-fi movie.
It really is. And it's happening so fast.
It is. And they even joked about, podcasts being a good break from constantly being on our phones.
Makes sense.
And they wondered, if Joe Rogan's amazing memory might have something to do with all those hours he spends having phone-free conversations on his show.
Interesting thought.
It is. They talked about how memory changes as you get older, especially for comedians trying to write jokes.
Yeah.
And they talked about the benefits of exercise, good blood flow, saunas and sleep for keeping your brain sharp.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff. They even mentioned Pete Sampras having a super strict sleep routine.
Wow.
Like, that's how seriously these guys take it.
That dedication.
Yeah. And then they got into creatine and how it can help with sleep deprivation. And they talked about its benefits, not just for muscle recovery, but for brain function too. And how dehydration and being tired can really mess with your mental performance.
Like athletes making mistakes when they're exhausted.
Exactly. Okay. Finally, they dove into the world of artificial intelligence.
AI, here we come.
And what the future might hold. They talked about how AI is becoming more and more common in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
Like writing emails, all these advanced features on our phones, and the massive amount of information we can access now through things like ChatGPT.
It's amazing, but also a little unnerving.
It is. And they pointed out that AI is only as good as the data it learns from.
Right.
So it's a powerful tool, but it's not perfect. And they told this funny story about an AI that generated some inappropriate images.
Oh, no.
Yeah, which just shows you that it's still got some limitations. And then they talked about how AI is just going to keep developing, driven by competition, especially with China. And they raised some concerns about AI's potential to manipulate people and the information we consume.
Yeah. Like, will we even be able to tell what's real anymore?
It's a valid question.
It is.
And then they even talked about, AI presidential candidates.
Now, that's a thought.
It's wild.
It is.
Kosta admitted that he's worried about, not being able to equip his kids to deal with this AI-driven future.
I think a lot of parents feel that way.
I do.
It's like, will traditional education even be enough?
And then things got really, really mind-blowing. They started talking about combining AI with quantum computing. And they mentioned this quote about quantum computers being able to solve problems that would take the entire lifespan of the universe to solve with regular computers.
That's crazy.
They even touched on the idea of quantum computers tapping into the multiverse.
Okay, now we're getting into science fiction.
Yeah. Imagine sentient AI powered by quantum computers and nuclear reactors.
Okay, that's a little scary.
It is a little bit, but then they contrasted that with the fact that we'll always need plumbers,
Right.
carpenters, people who work with their hands. And they wondered if, maybe humans will become obsolete someday, if AI becomes this superior life form without all our flaws.
I think it's a possibility, right? It's hard to say what the future holds.
They ended the AI discussion by, quickly tracing the timeline of human history from the Stone Age to where we are now. And they predicted even bigger changes in the next 100 years.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is. And they ended with this question. Will humans always need to gather and laugh together?
That's a good question.
Will we still find humor in all this craziness?
It seems like laughter is pretty fundamental to human nature,
I think so, too. And they talked about how, maybe memes will become the future of comedy.
Interesting.
But then there was also this thought, maybe we'll become obsolete and AI will just manage the planet better without us.
Like in Judge Dredd.
Yeah, exactly. They did end on a hopeful note, though. They think people will still be cracking jokes in the future.
Good. I like to think so, too.
Okay, that brings us to the end of this deep dive into Joe Rogan and Michael Kosta's conversation.
You've covered a lot of ground today.
Mm-hmm.
From the messy but ultimately rewarding process of creating comedy to the mind-blowing potential and the potential dangers of artificial intelligence.
So what resonated with you most? Is it that human drive to create, to connect, to find humor in the world?
Or is it the relentless and sometimes unpredictable march of technology?
And how do those two forces intersect in your life? What are your takeaways from this conversation?
And what new questions has it sparked for you about your own creative pursuits, your career, your relationship with technology?
That's something for you to think about. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.